Recording started. Well, it looks like we are definitely representing the country very well. I'd like to take this time to welcome you to this inaugural Research and Review webinar series. First, this session is being recorded, so you will be able to access it through a link that will be sent to you at a later time. I'd like to also make an announcement about upcoming webinars. We do have a Teacher Talk webinar in OER on January 17th, which is this Thursday at 6 p.m. Eastern Time. We also have a Competency Works webinar on January 31st at 3 p.m. Eastern. And to register for those, you would just click on that link there, imacall.org/events. So for today's session, we have here to present recent research in online learning from the Colorado Department of Education, Amanda Heine, who is the Senior Consultant for the Colorado Department of Education's Online Learning Unit. And I'd ask that you please make sure to note any of your questions and hold them until the end of the session when Amanda's done. Amanda, you can go ahead and take over now. Welcome. Thank you so much for being here.
Thank you. I really am very excited to be a part of the inaugural session, so that's really exciting for me. Welcome everybody who is here from across the nation. It's really exciting to get to present this research on a national platform, so thanks again. Let me just give you a quick background about where I'm from. I'm a Colorado native. I grew up in a very small southwestern or south central Colorado community, and it actually happened to be the site of the first online school in the state of Colorado. And so I was lucky enough my senior year of high school to participate in that program as a peer tutor. And so I built out the Algebra 2 webpage and helped tutor other students and do homework. And my sister ended up attending the same school, and my father actually works there now as a teacher. So I kind of got into online education unwittingly way back when. I've been a teacher in brick and mortar schools, and I also have taught in an online school. So have a lot of the teacher perspective, and I do have sort of a scientific background and have always loved doing research. So this was, when I got the chance to do this kind of research, it was great. It was right up my alley, and I'm super excited about it. Okay, and I did this research with Diane Leslie. She is our Senior Director of Research and Evaluation at the Department of Education, and with Dr. Amy Anderson as well. She is the Associate Commissioner of Innovation and Choice at the department right now. Okay, so why research? One of the big issues that we ran into last year was that we received a lot of media attention, and this was a couple months after I joined the department and after Amy had joined the department as well. So we were getting all these questions from the media, and what we really realized is that we didn't know as much as we should. And so we decided that if we were going to be the main source of information about online learning, all right, can you all hear me again?
Yeah, there you go, good. Now we can hear you.
All right, good. I've been troubleshooting all morning. I just came from another big webinar, and we had to do a bunch of this, so luckily I'm already warmed up. So here we go. So basically we needed to fill these data gaps, and we wanted to be the main source of information for the state so that everybody that was receiving this information would know that it was good information. So what we did was a combination of two studies, and our study ended up being a very extensive sort of exploratory data analysis. And then we also worked with the University of Colorado, Denver, and they did a sample study of some online schools for us where they did a survey of parents and students and then also administrators and teachers in as much of a representative sample as possible that we could come up with. So we were looking at some quantitative data that we had internally. We had years and years of quantitative student level data, and then the University of Colorado did more of sort of the qualitative survey approach for us. The data we utilized for ours was Colorado Basic Literacy Act. This is data that we collected. They were formative reading assessments that were performed in schools and used as diagnostic tools to diagnose K through 3 students as struggling or proficient readers. And then we have our state assessment program, which is the CSAP, and we used CSAP data. And then we also had 2 collections that we utilized where we had student demographics, entry and exit codes, the codes of the schools that they went to. So we had those 2 collections that we looked at as well. And one of the good things about Colorado, and this will be something that we talk more about in the end during we talk about the policy section, we do have a unique student identifier for all of our students. So this allowed us to track the students longitudinally, which was invaluable. All right, so this is when I was going through this data, we initially had some very very ambitious plans about the type of analysis that we were going to do. And as I looked at the overall trends in our online population in Colorado, what we saw was that the overall trends were just as interesting in and of themselves. And so these are some of the overall trends and changes that we noted. And just to give you some background, in Colorado, we have over 170 school districts and BOCES. We're a local control state. We have open choice enrollment, and currently we have 24 multi-district online schools that can serve students across the state. We have some of them are charters, some of them are just district run. We have 12 single district online schools and 17 single district online programs. So we have a pretty good offering in our state of choices. All right, so one of the first things that we noted in the online school was the change in demographics. We went back to 2003 because that's the earliest year that we had student level data. And what we noted was that in our online schools in 2003, they were 82% plus white. So a very low Hispanic population and very low minority population. So as the years have progressed, the population, the demographics have sort of become more representative of the state. They're still not quite to that state level as far as the Hispanic population, but we saw the white population decrease and the Hispanic population increase quite a bit. Okay. For free and reduced lunch eligibility. Now, this isn't probably the most reliable data just because there have been changes in how we collect this data, but in 2003, the free and reduced lunch percentage was about 7%. Now, that's increased fairly dramatically over the course of 2003 to 2007. I think there were a couple of schools that opened up that served at-risk students, and so that increased, and then we saw a dip. So this is very interesting. We definitely have a higher free and reduced lunch population, but again, we have to take it with a little bit of a grain of salt because we changed collection methods. All right. The pupil membership also changed. We saw a rapid increase in the high school level and sort of not as notable increases in elementary and middle school. And I think this visual actually puts this across really nicely. In 2003, our online population was 50% elementary school students and only about a quarter high school. And then in 2011, the majority of our students are high school students. So you can see through the years, basically the demographics and the target population of our online schools has really, really shifted. And I think with some of the issues that we've seen in a lot of the schools is that maybe the schools haven't shifted. So, all right. Now these are some of the statistics that we kind of got raked across the coals about with the media. We have our online schools as an aggregate have a much lower graduation rate than the schools across the state. This is a really interesting thing that we're seeing. I'll talk more about the different graduation trends that we saw later when we looked at individual students and cohorts, but graduation rates in our online schools are much, much lower than the state average. And the dropout rates, conversely, are much higher than the state level. Now, we have some coding mechanisms and instructions that are in place so that sort of explain the erratic nature of this dropout rate, and it's a lot about how the data is collected, so that's why that has sort of evened out over the years, is because we've gotten better at modifying our coding instructions. But you can still see that the dropout rate for online students for online schools as an aggregate is much higher than the state. And then we measure something called mobility in Colorado, and this measures atypical entries and exits from schools and districts in the state. And online schools have a much higher mobility rate. I think most of our online schools are in like the top 40 of the highest mobility rates in the state. So, and that again is entries and exits. It's not just exits and attrition. Okay. So the early years, Diane Leffley was the main person that looked at this, and she looked at several different data points, but she was focusing on students in K through 3. And so some of the key findings from this is that students attending online schools in grades K through 3 changed schools more frequently than their online peers, which is something that we saw in the mobility data, so that wasn't very surprising. It was interesting, though, she noted up to 15 different enrollment patterns of students being in and out of online schools or in an online school for a couple years and then leaving the online school. So there was just a lot of movement in these young students. And then the other thing that she noted was that a greater percentage of online students who had been assessed as on grade level with the CBLA assessment in the early years were not proficient when later tested on the CSAP. And I'll talk more about that in the next couple slides. And then the elementary age students in online schools consistently performed below their non-online peers in both reading and math assessments. All right. So this first slide shows the Colorado Basic Literacy Act data. And what she looked at was she looked at kindergartners and whether they were diagnosed as being at grade level or not. And then when they were tested on the CSAP in 3rd grade, whether they were actually on grade level. So what she found was that essentially online schools, for whatever reason, and this is again another one of the questions that we came up with, we found so many more questions from this research, but we don't know why this is happening. But the online schools were not as accurate as diagnosing struggling readers, or there was a decline in the level of proficiency from K through 3rd grade, but she looked at these students in different cohorts from like kindergarten to 3rd grade, then 1st grade to 4th grade, then 2nd grade to 5th grade, 3rd to 6th grade. And there is definitely a discrepancy in the brick and mortar schools as to identify these students, but that discrepancy was much larger in the online schools. And again, we're not quite sure why that is, but there was a big difference. And these are the CSAP reading results for a cohort of 3rd through 6th grade students. And you can see that the online students lag behind just based on academic achievement. They lag behind their brick and mortar peers. So this is consistent with what we had kind of seen before. And the same is true for math. And in math, there's even a more distinct difference between the performance of the online students and their non-online peers. All right. So we looked at students in 3rd through 9th grade as well. And some of the things that we found here were that students have a high chance of never attaining reading proficiency if they do not achieve it in the early grades. Students who attend multiple schools perform worse on average than students who have attended fewer schools. Most 9th graders in online schools were new to an online school in 2009 and 2011, and many of those were not proficient as 8th graders. And then very few 9th graders had been enrolled in an online school for at least 4 years. So we'll talk more about these. All right. So if we look at, I looked at 3rd graders through 9th graders, and what I looked at was the number of students who were not proficient in each grade level, so the number of students who were not proficient in 3rd grade. And then I looked at the number of those students who were still not proficient in 9th grade. So we could basically go back to 3rd grade and predict that almost 70% of the students who were not proficient in 3rd grade were not proficient in 9th grade. Now this was for all students. So what this basically shows us is that that early reading proficiency is extremely important, and especially in light of the CBLA data that we had seen before. If these students are not getting diagnosed early and not receiving those interventions early, then they have a really high chance of remaining not proficient for the rest of their high school career. And of course, as you go up in the grade level, as they get closer and closer to 9th grade, it gets more and more difficult to catch up. So by the time you get to 6th and even 7th grade, you have almost between a 75 and 80% chance that these students, if they're not proficient then, will not be proficient as 9th graders. So that's huge. And this is for all students. So we wanted to just get a baseline of what proficiency rates look like from year to year for all students. Okay. So it looks like, oh, I'm sorry, I transferred this into the Heine call template, and so this slide's a bit out of order. So pardon me for just a moment. Okay. All right. So what this shows here is we looked at 2 cohorts of 9th graders in 2009 and 2011. We couldn't look at these students in 2010 because we had a CSAP administration in one of our large schools. But we wanted to see how many schools these students had been in and what their rates of proficiency were as 8th graders. Because one of the things that we had heard from the field was that these students were coming to them, they had already been very mobile, they were new students, and they were very behind. So what we found, we looked at all the 9th graders in 2009 and all the 9th graders in 2011. And what we found was that almost 3/4 of those students, between a little over half and 3/4, this was their first time in an online school. They had never previously attended an online school. And then the other important part to this is that we looked at their proficiency in 8th grade, and their proficiency rates were extremely low. So not only was this their first time in an online school, but they were not proficient previously. So if you look at the 2009 cohort, again, almost 3/4 of them were new. They had a proficiency rate of 30.6% compared to the state rate, which was 60.9%. So they had half the proficiency rate. And then if we look at 2011, again, we see the same thing. Most of the 9th graders in the online schools were new, and their proficiency rate was extremely low compared to the state rate. The other thing that was sort of disconcerting about this is that I wanted to look at how many students had been continuously in an online school prior to enrolling in 9th grade. Now, I went back several years. I looked at went through lots of different filters. So I looked at whether they were in the same school, whether they were in an online school, but several different schools. And just to get students who had been in 4 years continuously in any online school, so they were continuously in an online environment, the furthest back I could go was 4 years, and I had a very low in number of just this 90, about 100. So there were very few students who had continuously been enrolled in online. Those that were actually performed fairly well and we had similar proficiency rates to their non-online peers. So let me go back a little bit. Okay, so what I wanted to show you here is that, so this will kind of sink in about the number of schools that they had been in and coming into this new environment. We looked at the number of schools that students had attended, and we measured it against whether or not they were proficient. So we looked at proficiency rates. And what we found was as soon as, this was 3rd through 9th, so we would expect these students to be between 3 and 4 schools, in elementary, middle, and then they were going into a high school. For this particular year, most of the students had been in 4 schools. But when we look at this, we found that proficiency rates dropped drastically as soon as these students went over 4 schools. So, of course, the more schools these students are in, the lower their proficiency rates are going to be. And what we found, again, I apologize for this. What we found was that, again, these first-time online students, those that were coming into the online school for the first time, had low proficiency rates. They had also attended, a higher percentage of them had attended a lot of schools. So these are kids, if you think about your own kids, I don't know if you have them, but these are little guys that have been in 6 or more schools from the time that they're in elementary, middle, and high school. So that's a lot of transition and a lot of movement. And so this online population in Colorado in particular is very mobile. All right. Okay. So those are the main takeaways from the formative years, and I guess, hang on, I'll wait and talk about some of the reasons why we chose those variables and some of the difficulties in doing those analyses towards the end, because part of that was just a huge process. So then we looked at graduates and dropouts, and we wanted to look at similar things. We looked at the number of schools that they had been in, and we looked at previous proficiency on their assessments. And the key findings we found here were that overall online schools' graduation rates are much lower than the statewide rates. Both online and statewide graduates had attended fewer schools on average than dropouts. And almost half of online graduates transferred to their current online school within the year they had graduated. And for dropouts, we found online schools' dropout rates are higher than the statewide rates. The online schools have a higher percentage of dropouts in grades 7 through 10 than the statewide dropouts. And nearly 60% of online dropouts had transferred to their current online school within the year they dropped out. All right. So when we look at this, this was actually sort of an interesting finding. As I showed you in one of the earlier slides, the demographics in the online schools have become more representative of the state demographics. So what we found, though, is that the dropout rates were also more representative in the online schools. So whereas in the brick and mortar in the state averages, Hispanics were much more likely to drop out. In the online setting, the Hispanic students made up more of a representative sample than in the statewide sample. So I'm not sure what that means yet, but that was an interesting find. Okay. Another interesting thing was that the percentage of all graduates and dropouts, if you look at the number of schools attended for each, and we're looking at 4 years. So we looked at what would basically be a high school career going from 9th through 12th grade. You would expect in our system to see 1 school. And for graduates, the vast majority of them only attended 1 school. It was about 70% of them attended 1 school through their high school career. And you can see that as the number of schools increases, the percentage of graduates it drops off. So that was very interesting. And then if you look at dropouts, they're in the blue. Their enrollment patterns are much more complex. So that's something that we need to explore further. But definitely the kids who were in one high school had that stability. That's what the graduates look like. And we looked at the average number of schools attended from 2007 through 2010. Statewide graduates had on average 1.4. Statewide dropouts were 2.8, so almost double. And same with the online dropouts. And even online graduates had attended a few more schools, which is probably them transferring into their online school. But one of the interesting things that I found just looking at individual data is that there were students who had attended up to 11 schools in the 4 years that they were in high school. And I couldn't even comprehend that. That's so much movement. That's almost 3 moves a year. So we're looking at some really, really highly mobile students, and we definitely need to figure out a way to identify how to give them this stability. So this was some of the interesting things that we found. Okay. So that's the breakdown of our study that we did internally. I would like to talk more about sort of the nitty-gritty nuts and bolts parts of that later when we get to questions and answer some of your questions, and just kind of talk about what our data systems look like in Colorado, because that really influenced that work. But I'm going to go ahead and move on to the next study, which was a survey study that University of Colorado at Denver conducted for us. All right. So this was a survey of K through 12 parents, and then they also put out a survey of students in high school. And we took an original sample of online schools. We had created a characteristics matrix. And so we tried to pick schools that made up a representative sample. We didn't do a representative student sample because we have several large districts who have really extensive IRB processes, and we were worried that if we had to do an IRB process for every single large district that this research would not get done. So we did this, and it wasn't the perfect way to do it, but in the timeline that we were able to get this done, that's what we had to do. So this is a look at the parent respondents. We had parents respond from across all grade levels, so that was good. And then we had our online high school respondents. We looked at the time they were in the online learning and their grade level. So we had about half and half that had just started online school that year, and then we had the other half who had been in this online school for at least 1 year prior. So some of the things that we looked at, one of the biggies that we really wanted to touch on was what was their previous experience in a brick and mortar school. These students are choosing online for some reason. Why are they choosing online? Did their previous experience in brick and mortar influence that? And two of the main things we found was just that the online parents and students were not satisfied with their brick and mortar schools for a variety of reasons. There were communication reasons, cultural reasons. They varied widely, but that was one of the main themes that we found, is that they were just not satisfied with their brick and mortar school. And then the other thing was that many of these students reported a high level of absenteeism at brick and mortar. They missed a lot of school while they were there. And here's some of the reasons broken down. The largest reason was illness. So I think that's really, really telling, and we need to examine that further. But illness was the biggest reason that they reported missing. Okay. And then we looked at the reasons that they chose an online school. And we looked at the high school parents and the students' reasons. Students liked the choice of classes. They wanted to graduate early. They wanted the classes to move faster, or they felt like they were falling behind and needed to change something or needed to make up credits. Parents really liked the choice of classes available also. And then the next biggest choice was that they had concerns about the environment in brick and mortar schools. So again, that relates directly back to their experience in a brick and mortar school, or maybe their perceived experience, but they did not want their children to be in the brick and mortar environment. Okay. Surprising, well, maybe not surprisingly to those of you who are in online education, but it was surprising to some of our researchers who conducted this at UCD. The students.
Looks like we've
Okay.
lost Amanda again. She'll be right back on.
Yeah, I'm back again. Can everybody hear? Okay. All right. So these students reported, and parents both reported, that they had enough access to many activities, and can you hear me now? Okay. All right. Sorry. Just wanted to make sure. Great. They reported that they had enough access to many online school supports and activities that maybe people who are not familiar with online learning would think. So they said teacher support was great. That was actually at the top. Technology, a variety of classes, guidance counselor support, and one of our top ones was also interaction with classmates and other students. So I think that provided really good insight into things that many people in the public perceive as drawbacks or things that are missing in online education. So I thought that was really valuable. Okay. And then we looked at the parent and student satisfaction with the online school. Students reported performing far better and being more motivated in their online school. They were more satisfied, but it was interesting. They reported a similar number of failed classes as when they were in their brick and mortar. So they were still not performing as well academically, but they were more satisfied and happier with the experience. So I don't know how to feel about that, but I thought that was very interesting. And then the parents and the students both felt that the communication at their online school was superior to communication at their most recent brick and mortar school, which is great. We looked at staff interviews as well. They, across the board, noted that parent involvement was critical. We asked them what was a characteristic of successful students, and it was sort of disappointing to me that they thought that was a successful characteristic of students, but they all noted that parent involvement was so important to how these students performed. They said that the public and traditional schools need to be educated about online learning. Professional development is much needed. The administration of state assessments is challenging for online schools in Colorado. These online students are required to come to a physical facility to do a paper and pencil test just like any other student across the state. And I know that does create problems when schools have students that are all over the state. So that was one of the things they noted. Somebody suggested an alternative accountability framework for online schools and an alternative funding mechanism. And this was actually suggested by the staff, was an alternative funding mechanism for all schools, not just online schools. So some of the key recommendations that we came up with were that online schools need to more accurately evaluate and diagnose their youngest students' reading levels. Now, this is true across grade levels, but it's even more critical based on what we found about the students not being diagnosed as accurately in the early grades as being struggling readers, and then to note that if they didn't have that early proficiency, their chances were really low of catching up. So that has broad implications for every school, but in particular online, they need to really tighten up how they're diagnosing those struggling readers. Online schools need to modify the programs and services they offer in order to better meet the needs of the students. We saw that the demographics changed dramatically over the course of the last 8 years, and so we really need these schools, as your demographics and as your student characteristics are changing, you need to adapt and change so that you have support services and you can differentiate for those students. Those things need to be in place. Excessive movement between schools should be avoided. Now, this was something that we talked about as far as parent choice and with schools. We've heard many anecdotal stories in Colorado about schools and districts having like sort of these push-out policies where if a student isn't performing very well, sometimes they don't get expelled, but they kind of get pushed out, or there are policies in place that are that are not kid-friendly. And so that needs to stop. And then parents just really need to be aware too that if they're choosing a choice environment for their student, they need to find the best fit. And this is something that we can do at the state level too, is say, we need to help these parents find better fits for their students and come up with ways to educate parents so they choose better schools that are long-term solutions and not just band-aids for their kids. And then the other really big thing, and this is something that we're wrestling with in Colorado a ton, is that we need to consider a different funding model for both online and brick-and-mortar schools. We have a lot of student mobility, we have a lot of student choice in Colorado, and we have a single count date. And so unfortunately, that provides a perverse incentive for districts and schools to be very aggressive about enrollment at the beginning of the year and get those kids through the count and get funded for them, and then maybe let up in their interventions. And so that's a big problem that we're seeing, so we need to address that. And then the other thing that needs to happen is we really need to look at these competency-based pathways. And when I think about those students who are coming to these online schools who are so behind and it's their first time in an online school, is it enough for us to just think about credit recovery on a Carnegie unit system, or do we really need to go in and be much more thoughtful and about how we diagnose those students and about how we fill in those gaps and get them through, so that we're not just getting them through courses, we're getting them the skills that they need to go to college and be successful and enter the workforce to be successful. All right. So what did we learn? One of the things I learned, just as far as from a data analysis perspective, is that in Colorado, and I don't know how this is in other states, we were very lucky in that we have a student identifier. So we have the ability to track these students over longitudinal periods of time. The problem is that this data is not readily available to schools and districts, especially unless they own those students. So that's where mobility creates another problem. So we need to figure out a way that we can get real-time data to districts and schools that's longitudinal, so that they can look at a student and know what interventions are going to be more useful, whether a student is at risk at all, and be able to diagnose them in a timely manner. So that was one of the big things I learned. So that's something that we're working on in Colorado right now, but it was really problematic. And the other thing was that we have a huge data warehouse, but it's extremely difficult, even for me, to get into. It was really, really difficult to get to the data, and the data was not stored in a way that was user-friendly for analysis. So a lot of the time I talked about what variables I picked. So I picked the number of schools to look at for mobility. And it took a couple weeks just to be able to wade through the data and clean it in order to do any kind of meaningful analysis on it. So we need to think, too, at the state level about how we're collecting and storing data. I think that's really important. As far as what we would do differently, I don't know that we would do anything differently for this study. This was a really good baseline analysis and provided us with lots of really good questions to go into in the future. I wish that we would have had more time. I think that it will be much easier to move forward on a lot of our other research questions now that we've gone through and cleaned some of this data and worked with it more extensively. We want to do a lot more analysis on graduates and dropouts and demographics, and look at more student level characteristics. So that's definitely something that we're going to do in the future. I don't know. I guess the best thing to do is go ahead and open it up for questions so that I can answer specific questions. So if we want to go ahead and do that, I'm happy to answer questions.
Thank you so much, Amanda, for sharing this work with us. What a huge undertaking. There were some questions that came up earlier, so I'm going to start off with those ones. Lisa Berry had asked, was data gathered about why the students have transitioned into online learning programs?
Yes. Yes. And that was part of the section that I talked about why they chose online schools, and it was primarily they liked. There were two primary reasons. They were dissatisfied with their brick and mortar school, and they liked the choice of classes, and then the other ones were all related to they wanted classes to move faster or graduate early or make up credits. So.
Perfect. Thanks for sharing that. David had asked, given the implications of the data, especially with regard to mobility, what support structures are you contemplating to help those highly mobile students? Because you had mentioned that some of them had moved up to 11 times in a year, so or 11 times over the 4 years in their high school careers.
So there's sort of a two-pronged approach that we need to take. And one is that we need to educate parents and schools and districts on how detrimental it is for students to move that often. They need to be aware of that so they can make better choices. So we really need to, because I think I've heard this anecdotally a lot, and again, I haven't confirmed it, but a lot of students have gone into online too, they're behind and they want to catch up, and then they are thinking about going back to their regular school. I would ask that people reconsider that, but a lot of people think, and I don't know if it's because how online has been marketed or not, but a lot of people think that it's just this really easy transition and they have sort of a romanticized version of what online is. So we need to be very, very strategic about educating people about what online is and isn't. And then we also need to look at policies that are pushing out kids. And it's a sad thing that happens, but I've worked in at-risk settings and I've seen it a lot. So that's one of the prongs. The other thing that needs to happen is that these schools need to get real-time data. And we're working on that right now at the state level to have a faster turnaround data system. Because the way it works now, we don't have a statewide student information system. If a student transfers to another school, the school has to request the transcripts from their previous school, wait on them, and by that time you can have lost tons of instructional time. Even if the kid doesn't have their IEP readily available, it costs you time, and it costs you interventions that you can move this kid. So I think that's the other approach, is saying, okay, how can we help schools get that data quicker, and also how can we help them get into the practice of doing quick diagnostics of their students so that they know where they're at when they get there and then can act on that very quickly. So I think those are both prongs that need to be set up.
Great, thanks for that. Lisa Berry had another question about the second study and as to whether or not the state supplemental school was included in the study as well.
No, these were only full-time schools in the state.
Okay, and then the last question that I saw running through as you were presenting was from Ann Roycroft, and she asked, is there any information provided about online teaching strategies used and the professional development provided to the teachers?
In this particular study, we did not look at that. So one of the things that we are going to be doing in Colorado, though, we have a new educator effectiveness system that's being piloted, and we will be looking at, all the teachers will be evaluated. They will all have a unique teacher identifier, and we will have a teacher-student data link, so we can start collecting information on that. And it's tied to student performance, and it's tied to classroom observations and practices, so we'll be able to start collecting data on sort of what the profile is of teachers who are effective online teachers. So.
there actually were a couple more questions that came up while I was asking you the other ones. Miles had asked, did you get a chance to look at data from blended schools? He mentioned students completing online coursework facilitated by outside providers but delivered within the walls of the brick and mortar. And if so, does this data look different or similar to fully online performance?
We did not look at that. In Colorado, as of this specific moment in time, we do not have a way to collect data on blended students, but we've created a blended student designation that will go into effect next year so that we can start collecting data on those students. So maybe we'll have some information next year at the end of the 2013-14 year.
Great. And Anne had a follow-up question. Can you talk about the transient nature of the students and why online would not be better for them if the online program is stable no matter where those students live, or is the online program dependent on the location?
I think that if you had a highly transient student, that an online environment could be the stability for them. If they're going to stay in the state and move across the state, then certainly that would be one setting and one set of expectations, and it would provide some stability. But we're not really seeing that they're staying with one particular school. Even the students who were continuously in online, they had switched through several schools during that time period. So I think it's more about, it's not so much dependent on this type of setting, but it's dependent on consistency of setting. So if they choose online as their long-term solution, then I think it can provide that stability. Or if they choose a brick and mortar, then it can. But it's just the going back and forth to through all kinds of different systems that's really problematic.
Okay, and Rob had a question. In Colorado, are dropouts tracked at all grade levels or just grades 9 through 12?
In Colorado, we track any student who is in 7th through 12th grade can be considered a dropout. So we track them from 7th through 12th.
Okay, I'm going to open the floor for any questions if anybody wants to take the mic and ask questions of Amanda.
Okay.
There actually was another question. Kate Carroll had asked, how is blended, quote unquote, blended quantifiable?
Well, this is how we're doing it. I don't know if this is the answer, but we've basically come up with a spectrum in Colorado. It used to be binary where a student was considered online or not online, and what we're doing now is we have a spectrum. So we have 100% brick and mortar, we've got less than 50% online, we've got 50% or more online, and we've got 100% online. So we're going to try that and see if we get the kind of data we want. We have to put out some guidance, and we have a specific definition that we're using to designate blended students, but that's how we're quantifying it. So,
are there any future steps in terms of research for the Colorado Department of Education? Are there any things that are kind of on the horizon for you guys?
One of the things that's been really exciting is that we have finally formed a research agenda group, a comprehensive group across the department, and this was something that we didn't have previously. So we've identified 5 areas of focus that we're going to be working on, but we're trying to really develop quality research and to keep it all in one space. So we will have an archive, and actually this research is posted on the archive. As far as online specific next steps, I really want to dig into the graduation and dropout statistics demographics, and what those students look like at a very granular level. So every characteristic: gender, race, homeless, instructional program, whether they have an IEP or not. The other thing that we didn't get to do as much of in this study as I would have liked to is that we actually have remediation rates for many students who go to Colorado post-secondary institutions. And so we want to look at online remediation rates versus brick and mortar remediation rates. The other thing that, again, we had wanted to do, but we couldn't, we have an MOU with the Department of Labor where we can access wage and employment information. And so we want to look at that and see if these students are working while they're in school, see if maybe if they don't go to college, maybe they enter the workforce and are very successful. So that's another thing that we would like to look at. Unfortunately, this time around, the Department of Labor uses a really arcane form of coding, and we couldn't unlock that data for this study. But that's another thing that we'd like to do. So we really want to see the long-term benefits of, or the long-term results of online education. So I think that just looking at internal state assessment data is very limiting. And so we want to really expand it and get a more granular level of who these students are.
Thanks for answering that. Kate Carroll had a follow-up question to her blended question regarding what does blended learning look like for the elementary grade level in Colorado?
We're mainly relying on the Insight Institute's definition of blended. So it's about the students accessing digital curriculum. It's not necessarily, we try to stay away from just ed tech, essentially. So we want it to be very specific that they're accessing content or skills practice, rather than just a student being on an iPad with no explicit instructional purpose. So that's I think that would be how we view blended here in Colorado at the elementary level.
Are there any other questions for Amanda? Amanda, I do have one other question in regard to if another state were thinking about doing some similar studies, what kind of things would you tell them to kind of look out for, be aware of as they prepare for something this huge?
I think the hardest thing for me, this is such a big question, and there wasn't a lot of research out there to sort of inform it. I don't know what other states' data systems look like, but I think that the biggest thing is to be very strategic in your research questions and make sure that they don't get too big. We had just so much, and I would have liked to do a nice, clean, scientific empirical study, and it just didn't turn out that way. So I think the best thing to do would be to get sort of a baseline of what data you have, and then think of a few limited research questions. The other thing that just has been invaluable to us is having that student identifier. And I think that's really going to be the key to figuring out how to move students along in accountability systems and everything, is that you need to look at the students on that student level data. If you're looking at schools, that's too broad. You need to break it down because I think that you have the potential to actually affect student performance and student outcomes when you look at it this way. But again, just getting a good idea of what kind of data you're working with and how your systems work, and having a thoughtful conversation with your IMS team about how they store things, because that was one of the biggest issues that we came up with. And if you have a student information system, then that's fantastic, because that was one of our big barriers. So. And I'd also like to just put the invitation out if anybody wants to call and pick my brain or get in touch with me about how we did this research. I'm happy to do that. and just talk you through or help you think about the things you'd like to look at.
Thanks so much, Amanda. If you can go ahead and put your work number in the text box, that would be great. And we greatly appreciate you taking the time to be here today and to share this great work with us. Any other questions for Amanda? We probably have time for one more question. All right, well, I guess that wraps it up. I have a few more announcements and also an evaluation link. If you would like to evaluate this session, please click on that tiny URL I just put in the chat box. Last few announcements. Again, the upcoming webinars, Teacher Talk OER webinar, January 17th, 6 p.m. Eastern Time. And Competency Works Aligning Competencies webinar, January 31st at 3 p.m. Eastern. You can register at that URL there. Again, please fill out the evaluation form, and thank you again so much to Amanda Heine and her team from the Colorado Department of Education, and to you all for joining us. I hope you have a wonderful rest of the week, and I'll be here if you have any questions. Thanks again, Amanda.